All right. Welcome to the Deploy Securely podcast, where we go deep on the security, privacy, and compliance implications of using AI. I'm your host, Walter Haydock, founder of StackAware. And today I'm joined by Oliver Patel. Oliver is the head of AI governance at AstraZeneca, leading the global governance of AI systems at scale across the enterprise. He focuses on turning complex regulatory requirements, especially the EU AI Act, into practical, actionable controls for managing AI risk, compliance, and governance in real world deployments. Oliver, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Walter. It's great to be on the show, and thanks for the kind introduction. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So you're governing AI at scale inside AstraZeneca. Obviously, that's a huge company. What sort of scale are we talking about in terms of number of models, teams, geographies, vendors? Can you talk about that? And then, what would break first if you haven't engineered AI governance into all your processes?
Big question. So when we think about enterprise AI governance in a company like AstraZeneca, or to be honest, any other company of that scale in a highly regulated industry, and just for context, AstraZeneca has just under 100,000 employees, operates globally, is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. AI governance is becoming such a rich field and means so many different things to different people. So when we talk about enterprise AI governance in a company of that scale, we're talking about lots of different things. So we're talking about how all employees across the workforce use AI. So the kind of general rules and principles for kind of employee use of AI. So that's kind of the democratized angle. Then we're talking about how we sort of procure and onboard vendor provided AI solutions. And just like any other organization, of course, we use foundation models provided by the big players, the big AI and tech companies. And then, of course, we're also talking about building our own systems internally, mainly for sort of internal research and process efficiency and optimization purposes. So building models and building systems that we deploy internally into production. So there's kind of many different layers to it. There's the all workforce use of AI and what are the kind of key responsible AI rules and principles and guardrails there. There's the procurement and the due diligence and the kind of ongoing management of vendors and how we work with external partners. And then there's the kind of AI systems that we build and deploy internally. So when we think about enterprise AI governance, we're talking about all of those things. We're not just talking about the governance of AI systems. And what you find interesting potentially is that despite it being obviously a heavily regulated sector, it doesn't mean that all of our use of AI is kind of high risk and in a high stake setting. Just like any other company, we're applying AI in so many areas that are not necessarily high stakes and highly regulated, but have huge implications and potential opportunity for how effective and innovative and productive we are as an organization. So the balancing act there for enterprise AI governance leaders like myself is how to put in place the guardrails and the safeguards for the high risk systems without kind of over governing and getting in the way of much of the rest of the AI activity, which probably isn't high risk, at least not from a regulatory perspective.
Understood. Thank you for that. So I want to drill down a little bit specifically on the pharma kind of use cases that are critical to AstraZeneca. So what do you see are the highest risk use cases, whether that's R&D, clinical trials, safety, manufacturing? How would you rank those and what are the top controls that you focus on applying for those use cases?
Absolutely. So you mentioned at the beginning the EU AI Act, and the EU AI Act presents an interesting, wouldn't necessarily say a conundrum, but an interesting dynamic for big pharmaceutical companies like AstraZeneca. And that's because, on the one hand, we have the research exemption. So, for those that don't know, it's a relatively broad exemption from the scope of the EU AI Act for kind of AI systems and AI activities that are solely for sort of research purposes, which isn't just academic and scientific research. It can also apply to research in the business and product context. And then on the other hand, of course, AI systems, in particular, AI-enabled medical devices, are in the high-risk category. So there's certain AI applications that we would develop and use that may be in the high risk category, and then there's others that may be kind of exempt because it's research. And then there's the interesting conundrum of what to do about something that could start off as research and isn't in scope of law at all, and then could progress and graduate to become something high risk because of the way it will be used in future if that what started off as research becomes a production application. So, I mean, obviously, nothing too groundbreaking. The more direct impact on patients, obviously, the bigger the potential risk. Now, there's obviously a lot of use of AI at the earlier stages of drug discovery and drug development, and that's more, I mean, of course, it's hugely impactful, but the direct risks of adverse impact are obviously less than the risk when we're using AI in settings that are closer to patients and how they may be treated, what information they may receive, clinical trial design, that kind of thing. So, but I think this is worth pointing out that, you know, actually that's a very small proportion of what big pharmaceutical companies are doing with AI overall. It's really about looking at each constituent part of the drug discovery, development, manufacturing, and commercialization process and seeing how each part can be in some way optimized and accelerated and kind of reimagined with AI.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So you cued me to talk a little bit more about the EU AI Act and how you're facing one conundrum, which is an interesting one, about how there can be potentially gray area between the research exemption and the high risk use cases. Another conundrum that I've been kind of watching from afar, and it's something that you probably need to deal with on a daily basis, is the high risk requirements for the EU AI Act. Right now, barring any sort of change, which is unlikely, but assume there's no change, will come into force on August 2nd of 2026, if my math is correct. Now, there is a harmonized standard or draft out there that explains how to build a quality management system that would give you a presumption of conformity, but it is not approved yet. And despite some notes to the contrary late last year or the middle of last year, now it looks like these high risk requirements will be pushed back a little bit. So what's your take on that with respect to the harmonized standards, and, you know, how can things improve?
So obviously now this whole topic of EU AI Act and the compliance dates for high risk AI systems has moved into the political realm of the EU. So it's really something that I've obviously been watching and analyzing closely. I've written and published quite a lot about it. So just to kind of take a step back and explain the situation, as you said, the enforcement date, the applicable date for high-risk AI system compliance is the 2nd of August, 2026. What the European Commission proposed in their EU AI Act simplification proposal last November is that applicable date for high-risk AI system compliance should be pushed back, potentially up to 16 months back, mainly because the kind of package of technical standards or harmonized standards that companies can use to actually figure out how to be compliant with these provisions isn't ready, and therefore companies should have more time to actually digest the standards as they come online and prepare their compliance programs. So in my opinion, that makes good sense. It makes sense it's obviously difficult for organizations to know exactly what they're supposed to do with respect to high-risk AI system compliance without the standards, because as we both know, the actual obligations and requirements in the AI Act for the providers and deployers of high-risk AI systems are written in, I would say, a high-level manner. I mean, it says, you know, you must have accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity. We both know that in itself, that one or two lines really requires a huge amount of detail, stipulating exactly what that means, what you should be doing, what the different metrics you should be using for evaluation are, what levels you should be meeting, all that kind of thing. So on the one hand, we have this uncertainty. So it's well-intentioned, trying to help organizations with a pragmatic approach, delaying whilst these standards come online. But of course, now we have this uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. Any smart organization, any sensible organization is obviously just assuming that the The enforcement date will remain August 2026 and continuing to prepare accordingly. And if it gets delayed, it gets delayed. So we all have to basically work on the assumption that it won't be delayed. And if it does, then I guess we have a bit more time. But there's no doubt that it's difficult without the standards to know exactly what you're supposed to do.
Absolutely. There is some ambiguity there. So, given that situation, what are you doing that you can share, and what would you recommend that other companies in the same position do right now, assuming that the standard's going to come online, their high risk requirements are going to come online in August of this year? What are some practical, tactical things you can do right now to get ready?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the standards will obviously outline the nitty gritty of exactly what it means for a high risk AI system to be compliant, whether it's relating to transparency, human oversight, logging of inputs and outputs, all the kind of technicalities. Now, you may not know exactly what you're supposed to do without the standards, but ultimately, there's a huge amount that companies can and should be doing to prepare for this part of the EU AI Act. And honestly, it's just basically the good practice enterprise AI governance work that I kind of advocate for. So the key pillars of enterprise AI governance, having your 5 key pillars that I talk about, having your policies and standards in good shape, and those being aligned to different regulatory requirements and standards for best practice worldwide, having your risk and impact assessment processes operating effectively, so you actually assess risks up front and manage risks on a continuous basis throughout the AI lifecycle, obviously applying greater scrutiny and more rigor on the higher risk AI systems and AI use cases, and ensuring that it really is not just the one and done, but it is an ongoing, continuous lifecycle risk management process. The third pillar, obviously having an operating model and an accountability structure to support that. Who's actually going to perform those assessments? Who on the business or the technical side is responsible for ensuring the system is developed in accordance to your policies and standards, and that the ongoing lifecycle management actually happens in the right way? And then who is accountable for making big decisions as and when they arise? The fourth key pillar, having the appropriate tooling to actually manage AI governance at scale. Obviously, you need some kind of AI inventory or AI catalog to keep track of all of this. And with regulations like the EU AI Act, you've got a situation where actually many of your AI systems won't be in scope, but for the ones that are, there's a huge amount of work to do. So having the policies, the risk assessment process, the operating model, and the catalog or the inventory is the only way to kind of get a handle on this and figure out, okay, what is in scope and how can we apply the right level of governance to it. And then fifth and final pillar, everything around AI literacy, ensuring that your organization is aware of what's coming and what's in force today, what are the risks and what are the regulatory obligations in this space, and then kind of role-based literacy for the technical community and others involved in the kind of AI lifecycle, whether it's from a development, deployment, or governance and oversight perspective. So irrespective of when these standards drop and when the dates for high-risk AI system compliance is live, there's absolutely no reason to delay putting in place and refining and strengthening the core pillars of enterprise AI governance that are not just there to enable EU AI Act compliance, but are there to enable you to manage the risks of AI whilst navigating regulations globally and maximizing the value of your AI investments by kind of applying the right balance of risk mitigation and value realization.
Awesome. So definitely 5 pillars that any organization should implement if they are using AI, whether in the European Union or elsewhere. On the note of catalogs and inventories, at a huge company like AstraZeneca, how do you ensure that you're tracking all of this stuff, including models developed in-house, kind of no-code projects, individual open source agents that may be running, OpenClaw maybe, embedded AI in third-party tools? How do you track all this?
Well, I mean, it's obviously challenging, but it's really important. I mean, the tracking and more broadly the kind of observability and knowing what's out there is foundational to AI governance, because at the risk of repeating a cliche, you obviously cannot govern or manage what you are unaware of. So what's interesting is that this whole cataloging and tracking and observability piece, actually, although you might be initially or primarily doing it for kind of governance and oversight and compliance purposes, it actually serves as a kind of key driver for why AI governance is a valuable activity beyond just risk mitigation and compliance. So when I kind of set out the business case for AI governance, it centers around playing both defense and offense. And actually, I make the case that having kind of robust processes in place for cataloging and observability is actually really part of playing offense, because the data that you get and the kind of insights that you get from keeping track of what you're doing with AI across the organization, from your kind of internally developed and deployed models and systems that are in production, to the vendors that you work with, to the kind of use of everyday democratized AI applications, such as your kind of enterprise LLMs, whatever your organization's using. Ultimately, that data and the insights and metrics you can get from that is actually much more powerful than just it enables much more kind of powerful benefits than just the compliance and risk angle, because it really empowers your senior leaders to understand what's the organization doing with AI, what's working, what's not working, where should we double down, where should we scale back. So almost like AI governance, when done well, can serve as a data intelligence function and a key part of kind of driving forward the AI strategy. So it's a challenge, but actually I think organizations understand, or kind of forward-thinking organizations understand, that there's immense value to doing this cataloging that goes far beyond things like EU AI Act compliance. Although, of course, that's the main kind of driver, we find that there's so much more benefit to getting this data and getting these insights at scale in a continuous way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think from my application security days, some people might think this is controversial, but I think it makes sense, is that security is really just a quality problem, is one way to look at it. So if you improve your quality, you're going to improve your security, but you'll also improve the business performance of the system that you're talking about. So I think I definitely see where you're headed on that. And you can look at things like, what metrics are you tracking? Are you looking at, how often people are using tools, things like that. You might want to know that from a governance perspective if someone's using a certain tool, but you also want to know from a financial perspective, because if no one's using the tool, then why are you even keeping it in your inventory? Why are you paying for it? Why are you maintaining it? Maybe just get rid of it, move on to the next.
And obviously we live in an era where so many companies are sort of essentially LLM wrappers. Not that there's a problem with that, but there's just so many kind of AI companies that you can look at, and the cataloging and the tracking helps you identify, do we need to work with all of these 3 or 4 different organizations that provide a similar service or a similar product? Do we pick one? It could be like different parts of the business have organically built relationships with different companies, or even sometimes the same company. So the cataloging and the tracking enables you to potentially weed out some inefficiencies or duplication, which is what happens in every company above a certain size. And interestingly, to your point, I actually think the data on how AI is being used is as well really valuable from both a governance perspective and a business and AI strategy perspective, in the same way that it's really important for us as a society to understand how AI is being used. I think the studies done by organizations like Pew Research Center in the US, the Ada Lovelace Institute and Alan Turing Institute in the UK, and also like AI labs like OpenAI, Anthropic, all of this research that's published on how the world is using AI is super valuable and important. It's showing us things like increasing emotional attachments and relationships and dependence on AI, increasing use of AI for things like companionship, for things like mental health support. It's showing us how much AI is being used in domains like coding and other kind of domains that are highly technical or mathematical and scientific. and just how much people are going to AI for health advice and for practical advice and support. So all of that is super valuable in terms of societies and organizations figuring out how to govern AI. And similarly, internally, knowing how your workforce is using your kind of main democratized AI applications can help you tailor the training better, tailor the guidance better, implement specific guardrails, because obviously you can't assess every use of AI. You have to have guardrails to automate governance and help you figure out is basically what's working, what's not working, where may we need to intervene or course correct. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate, I guess, for kind of obviously in like an anonymized, privacy preserving way, having this rich data on how AI is being used is super valuable from a governance perspective, and as I said, a strategy perspective, because it really helps you to figure out where you should kind of double down, place your bets, and where maybe it makes sense to change course in some areas.
You alluded to something just then, which I would describe as kind of a citizen developer, maybe citizen AI engineer type role, where individuals who aren't necessarily developers by their job description are using artificial intelligence for a variety of purposes. Maybe they're even building their own applications using AI. They're potentially using no-code automation tools like Zapier or OpenAI, Agent Builder. What's your take on how you handle those types of situations where you have enthusiastic people who are deploying AI within the organization to do their jobs better, who may not necessarily be experts on managing the risk?
Fantastic question. And it's taken 20 minutes, but I'm finally going to mention my book because I cover this topic in great detail, because I think it's one of the most important topics for AI governance in 2026 and beyond, the democratization of AI. That really is the big story, in my opinion, of the last, let's say, 4 years. Not the models, not the data, not the compute, not the energy, but the democratization. We've had deep learning models, and we've even had GPT models for several years now. But really, from 2022 onwards, when ChatGPT was launched, it's this explosion in the adoption of AI at scale all over the world. By some metrics, you could say that ChatGPT was the fastest adopted consumer application of all time. I know it's debatable, but there's a case there. So we're kind of now moving to this next wave of democratization. So now everyone is using chatbots and generative AI applications for like Q&A, putting in an input, getting an output. And increasingly in forward-thinking enterprises like AstraZeneca and many others that are very kind of heavily investing in technology and closer to the frontier, it's not just generative AI chatbots that are democratized. It's, as you've alluded to, democratized platforms where you can build assistants and bots and agents with low code and even no code tooling. Now, this represents a really interesting question for governance. I think the first question is, every organization now has a choice to make with respect to how much they want to democratize AI, right? So there's absolutely no rule that says you have to go all in. And there's also no rule that says you can't let your employees do anything. There's a whole spectrum of choices here. I speak to some companies and I ask them, how advanced are you on AI? And say, oh, we're really advanced. Everyone has, Copilot or ChatGPT Enterprise, whatever it is. I'm thinking, okay, is that it? Like everyone has access to one AI tool. And then in other companies, it's like everyone can basically go off and do whatever they want with any AI tool. So it's a whole spectrum of possibilities. And I guess every company has a choice to make. Do they want to be more kind of conservative and restrict access to kind of cutting edge capabilities to the wider workforce, or they want to give the wider workforce the kind of powerful, highly capable, democratized kind of AI tools where they can build even if they're not technical experts? And if so, what are the deployment patterns and modalities that will be permitted? So obviously I can't go into details exactly what we're doing internally, but what I can say is that I think companies, it's an interesting conundrum, right? Because it goes to the heart of balancing risk and innovation or value. And I think that obviously if you are going to go further down the spectrum of providing access, being pro kind of citizen development, pro democratization, there are of course important things you can do to manage risk. And that's what I call the 3 Gs for governing democratized AI. So first of all, green light. You have your approved platform. So it's not just a total free-for-all. You've got your approved, vetted, enterprise-grade platforms where people can build and deploy AI assistants, AI agents, whatever it is. Then guardrails, the second G. You've figured out what your most important policies that you want to enforce are, and you kind of engineered policy as code guardrails into those green lighted platforms that are being used. So for example, if there's certain types of agents that you don't want people to build, you have guardrails in place to prevent or detect that. And then third is guidance, because ultimately you cannot manually assess every use case if you're going to go all in on AI democratization. So it makes the AI literacy piece and the guidance that you provide to the workforce more important than ever. So green light, guardrails, guidance. If you're going all in on AI democratization, I would say those are three really important pillars for risk mitigation. And of course, that's quite high level. There's a lot more detail that we could drill down into.
I like it, the 3 Gs of AI democratization. Very nice, very nice. So you mentioned the green light side of things, and the question I was going to ask is about having those approval gates. So how would you advise companies to develop these types of approval processes? Who should be involved? Who should make the final decision? How should these things run?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because if I think about my time in enterprise AI governance, it's been about 3.5 years now doing this work. And this has always been the kind of $1 million question. What actually requires an AI governance assessment and potentially an approval, or at least a risk review? It's not an easy question to answer, right? Because when you think about it, AI comes in so many different shapes and sizes. Now, if we're onboarding a new AI vendor that's selling us a SaaS-based product that we're going to use at scale across our organization, then obviously it triggers the kind of legal, procurement, AI governance, due diligence processes. No one would dispute that. Then on the complete other end of the spectrum, if I, Oliver Patel, just wants to go into the kind of internal AI solutions we have available and put in a prompt, maybe to help me write an email, does that need an AI governance assessment? I think we would all say, no, it doesn't to that one. And we would all say, yes, it does to the first example. The problem is, right, in this era of democratized AI, where it's getting easier and easier to build and deploy AI systems, AI capabilities, it kind of forces governance community to think, well, what should actually be in scope of these risk assessment and impact assessment processes that we put in place? We can't just say all AI use cases go through this process, whilst also democratizing the ability to build and deploy AI. We have to almost like refine and sharpen the scope and remit of these AI governance processes. Either it can be on risk-based criteria or capability-based criteria, or you say that actually the kind of everyday regular use of AI on democratized platforms doesn't need to go through governance because of the training and the guidance and the guardrail. So I'm not gonna kind of come up with the answer, because every company would approach this differently. But what I'll say is the key question for AI governance leaders is be really sharp and really tight in defining the scope of what the AI governance process is for, what should go through it, because actually it's becoming very gray in most cases. It's no longer the simple, oh, we either buy this from a vendor or our data science and engineering teams build it internally. So much is now in the middle, and it's kind of forcing a rethink. So how you treat, again, as part of that, how do you treat POCs versus full production deployment? Do you let kind of POCs just crack on, or teams crack on with POCs in kind of sandbox type environments without any kind of review process, or are you really hands-on with your kind of reviews and oversight at the very early stages? So these are the sorts of questions that companies have to answer. So what I'm going to do in my book, Fundamentals of AI Governance, is kind of lay out the framework for what are these key pillars of enterprise AI governance. Actually, I've got 10 in the book, but when I talk on podcasts like this, I say 5 because it's more manageable than me reeling off 10 key pillars. But it's like, what are those key pillars of enterprise AI governance? And then crucially, how do you as an organization determine what should be your posture and approach to AI governance in terms of AI democratization, in terms of how wide do you cast the net from a risk and oversight perspective? What should be in scope of your AI governance processes? What should your kind of risk appetite be, and how do you even figure that out? How do you even determine that? So what I'm trying to do with my book and the content I'm putting out there, it's almost like give people the framework and the tools to, and give organizations the framework and the tools to understand the most important questions they need to be asking in AI governance that are relevant for AI today, not AI in 2023, and then almost like enable them to figure out themselves what makes the most sense for their organization based on their values, their organizational culture, strategy, risk appetite, all of that good stuff. So yeah, there's no kind of answer to the question, but the key question is what should be in scope of AI governance, and it's not an easy question to answer the more you think about it and the more you drill into it.
Well, let's dive into your book. I'd love to hear more about that. So, it's coming out later this year from what I understand, and would love to, for you to give an overview of what you're covering. Obviously, you addressed it a little bit, but anything else the audience should know about it?
Well, it's been a cathartic exercise, I must say. So the book is called Fundamentals of AI Governance, and it's essentially aiming to be the definitive practitioner guide to enterprise AI governance. So it's business focused, it's practitioner focused, it's enterprise focused, and it lays out the step-by-step framework that I've developed and refined over the past few years working on the front line of AI governance for how to implement, scale, and really mature and embed an enterprise AI governance capability within any organization, although it is probably more skewed towards kind of the enterprise context. So it starts off by surveying the risks of AI and the limitations of AI, looking at more classical machine learning, deep learning, Gen AI, and agentic AI. So I kind of not just focusing on LLMs and Gen AI, but looking at all different types of AI, the kind of key fundamental limitations that we have to be aware of as AI governance practitioners that we need to design and build around and kind of acknowledge as part of what AI is, such as hallucinations, sycophancy, non-determinism, bias, all of that stuff. Then looking at kind of enterprise AI risk themes. So the areas in which enterprises are most exposed to reputational, regulatory, legal, financial, operational risk. Then it kind of goes deep into global AI laws and policies. So looking at regulations and kind of policy approaches in key jurisdictions like the US, China, Japan, Korea, the UK, and kind of what's happened on the international stage. Then it's a deep dive into the EU AI Act, and obviously it's the only really comprehensive AI law out there. So there's a whole chapter dedicated to the EU AI Act. Then there's a piece on kind of how do you manage and navigate the cross-jurisdictional AI compliance? How do you actually figure out, okay, we've got these laws in China, in the EU, in US states, we've got standards like ISO 42001 and a whole suite of other ISO standards and other technical standards. What should we then as an organization do in terms of, especially if we're operating globally, to actually manage and navigate the complexity of all these different rules and frameworks and how they fit together? And then finally, the kind of, I guess, the core original contribution of the book and the most kind of important part is then my framework for implementing enterprise AI governance, going into detail on the 10 key pillars and then how to approach AI governance from a kind of tactical, strategic, and people-based perspective. So really, it's taking everything I've learned from doing this work as a practitioner over the past few years, but also as someone who has a background in government policy and regulation, and also academia as a former policy researcher and philosophy student back in the day, kind of taking all that together and putting together a practical guide to enterprise AI governance that I hope will be quite accessible, but it is focused more on the practitioners who are working in this space.
Sounds good. In terms of keeping it up to date, you mentioned not wanting to write the book on AI governance for 2023 and 2026. How are you going to keep it up to date? Is it going to be evergreen? Is it going to be digital, physical? How's it going to work?
Oh, it's a great question. It's really difficult. I think one of the reasons why it's been a cathartic process is because you think, okay, I've been writing about AI governance on my newsletter and LinkedIn for several years now, but I even read back to stuff I wrote 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I'm like, I can't use this anymore. It's completely out of date now. So I'm almost like, I kind of thought I had written more of the book than I had when I started it, and the pace of change and the velocity of this field in general is such that, you can't take your eye off it, basically. So I'm not going to make any kind of hard commitments today about I need to get the first version out. Basically, I need to publish the first edition of the book before talking about anything that I may do next. But what I will definitely do is continue to share articles and essays and resources on my newsletter, Enterprise AI Governance. I don't know, maybe I'll formalize the updates to the book through that newsletter. It's definitely the platform that I'm putting the most energy and attention into. Got a community of about 7,000 AI governance practitioners and professionals and others working across this set of issues on my Substack, Enterprise AI Governance. So what I'll most likely do is continue to evergreen the content via the newsletter and accept that, any book on AI is going to be very hard to keep it up to date. Hopefully it is relevant and has principles and frameworks that stand the test of time, but I'm also not naive enough to think that a book on AI governance maybe isn't going to go out of date in some ways, especially talking about laws and regulations that are in flux. So it's probably through Substack that I'll keep the content evergreen. But who knows? Maybe I'll decide to do a second edition and a third edition and go on indefinitely, like some authors do.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up here, anything else you'd like to plug? Obviously, I could recommend your newsletter, which I am a subscriber to, and I look forward to the book. Anything else you'd like to highlight to the audience?
Well, I think just to say that I really think it's early days for AI governance. So I've got nothing else to plug. I plug my book and my newsletter. Those are the two things that I'm kind of closest to my heart at the moment when it comes to the work I'm doing in this space. But I just think that it's a really exciting time to work on this set of issues, because despite AI having kind of been a concept, I guess, since the 1950s and a field of research and work since then, and despite there having been so much hype on AI for the past few years, I really think that what the AI governance and responsible AI community is doing, whether you're working in a more technical role as a kind of security researcher or building guardrails or working on ML ops or working on evals, or whether you're in a more governance and policy focused role like myself, writing and implementing policies or building out training or literacy or advising and consulting organizations, or whether you're a student that's kind of interested in this space, I just think that it's a great time almost to work in AI governance, because I think as a community, the work we're doing is truly making an impact on shaping how we as humanity will engage with and be affected by this revolutionary technology. So personally, I'm happy to be part of this community, and I find that it's a really collaborative and supportive professional community. So I guess just to say to anyone out there watching that maybe is considering coming into this space or considering whether it's for them, I would say that what I'm seeing now is that the AI governance profession is actually very broad, and there are so many different things you can do in AI governance now. You don't have to be a deep technical expert. You don't have to be a legal or regulatory expert. There's so many things you can do in this space, and I think it's just a really exciting time to be in the industry. But there are lots of big challenges, and I think we've barely scratched the surface on them in this discussion.
We have scratched the surface, but not much else, unfortunately. So we really appreciate your time, Oliver. Thank you for coming on the show. And to our audience, this has been the Deploy Securely podcast. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.